welcome to the In Transit podcast, a place where we discuss all things supply chain. I'm your host, Vishnu Rajamanickam. In this episode, we are joined by Navneet Lekshminarayanan, the founder and CEO of supply chain risk management firm Holocene, to discuss the complexities within service supply chains. While production supply chains get most of the attention, service supply chains play a crucial role in maintaining brand reputation and driving profitability. They are responsible for managing spare parts, repairs, and services long after a product's lifecycle ends. These supply chains are complex, unpredictable, and require unique planning approaches, especially when it comes to meeting demand in a world where disruptions from geopolitical events to natural disasters are all too common. In this episode, Navneet will share insights on the challenges these supply chains face, the role of technology, and how businesses can navigate the complexities to stay ahead. So, buckle up and let's get started. Hey Navneet, welcome to the In Transit podcast. It's great to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
We've known each other for a while now, but for our listeners, could you start by introducing yourself and sharing a bit about what you do at Holocene?
Of course. I'm Navneet, the managing director and founder for Holocene. We are a young Berlin-based company revolutionizing supply chain execution. It's a known fact, but often unsolved problem because it's messy. And that's what you're here to solve.
That was a concise introduction. Thanks for that. Let's jump right into the topic. Production supply chains are often in the spotlight, right? Like whether it's the need for visibility between suppliers across tiers, the focus on technologies for demand planning, or even strategies for optimizing sourcing operations. But service supply chains, I assume, are quite different altogether. Could you run me through some fundamentals on how they differ from production supply chains and what unique challenges do they bring to the table?
Wow. So let's start with the first part itself. Why service supply chain is important. From my perspective, service supply chain has a deep impact on your brand and your brand reputation. And the other part, service supply chain is highly profitable. The goods, the spare parts that you kind of sell are highly profitable and a high margin business. You don't want to lose it to a competitor who can kind of rip it off and service the customers better. And in that case, that's why I think so that service supply chains are often neglected, but those can bring in a huge chunk of revenue to the company. And often neglected is because they bring in complications, and that's what Vishnu had asked me for, is the difference between service and production. So let's start with any supply chain, be it production or service. It starts with the demand plan itself, and that is where it gets differentiating between both the topics. For a production supply chain, the demand is predictable. Even though you have planning tools, seasonal volatility, other things, but it's predictable how many orders you're going to get, how many places or warehouses you need to deliver to. There's a lot of data around it. But when it comes to service supply chains, the demand planning itself gets wrong, because how do you predict which part is going to fail in which install bases that you have in which location? And that's where the first part gets wrong. And if you start getting the demand planning wrong, then it becomes all the downstream activities after the demand plan starts going wrong. And then becomes the philosophy in itself between the service and the production side is production has a limited end of life. Maybe you have a production cycle for 2 years and then you stop the production and you launch a new product. While the service supply chain needs to continue servicing those products even after end of life for years together. In most cases, at least 10 years, based on different regulations and legislations. And just imagine the number of SKUs that one needs to handle in a service supply chain. And some of these SKUs are fast moving ones, some of them are slow moving ones. You need to keep a stock of it, also coordinate with your supplier. Now, the suppliers for these old SKUs can also have end of life. So it gets pretty complicated. And second is the philosophy in itself. So production supply chains mostly work in just in time, that I need my materials or my goods just in time so that the demand is catered, so that the cash is not blocked. You can't have that same mentality and philosophy in service supply chains, right? You never know when a part will fail, and you have to make sure that your part is available and ready to ship to the customer. And yeah, for these reasons, it's just vastly different, and it requires a different set of plannings, the data that you need to kind of capture to kind of make sure the plans are right, even the production plans or the supply plans for service supply chains. And it's often a topic which people don't really like to kind of mess around with.
That's a pretty comprehensive explainer. You mentioned about the challenges service supply chains have with understanding their demand. Now, the whole challenge of understanding demand often stems from a lack of clear visibility, right? On the production side of supply chains, where demand visibility is a bit better, things are already pretty complex and chaotic. But with service supply chains, as you mentioned, there's an additional layer of complexity with managing inventories to unpredictable demand. Could you talk more about the issues with visibility from the context of technology? I assume a lot of companies continue to run legacy systems. So, what's the extent of their struggle to gain visibility?
Vishnu, this is like a most talked about topic in terms of supply chain visibility, right? Everyone wants visibility in terms of where their goods are, where their inventories are, so they can plan things better. But at the end, left with an ERP, which does not have real-time data. Now, looking at service supply chains, okay, so it brings in some bit of added complexities. Again, apart from the suppliers and the complexity of the SKUs, how do you even have the mentality whether you want to keep all the stocks with you at once, or do you want to just source it from your suppliers as and when the order comes in? These are decisions which depends on the margins on the products and how critical these components are. The larger difference in terms of visibility is in service is most companies tend to forward stock their inventory to a dealer, or in case the supply chain has that kind of a network, and people generally do not have visibility on what is the inventory at a dealer in real time. Why would a dealer kind of share the stocks they have on the ERPs of the main supplier or the OEM? And that's when things starts getting messy. And imagining the number of dealers or install bases that you have, this can get very quickly into a huge mess to untangle with. And the other side is with service supply chain is the reverse logistics also. Because sometimes you get parts and you need to repair and put it back into inventory while the customers are given with new parts, while the old parts are shipped back, it needs to be repaired and put back to inventory. And the supply chain planning needs to get this visibility also, that how much returns or repaired inventory is available, what is the value of those inventory, how soon it can be put back into available stock. And some of these activities are always outsourced. So also brings in the right level of tools and how quickly you can get these ground level insights back to the central planning team, if you have one, is the core essence of visibility. Now, most of the times, the visibilities are on spreadsheets. Probably a forward stocking location kind of sends it. The demand which they forecast over a spreadsheet, and this keeps changing while the transportation time keeps changing. All of these being fed back into the demand forecast is super messy at this point in from how I see the world. And the second part, if I'm kind of repeating myself on the demand forecast, is because that brings the apex of all supply chain KPIs. If you get that top tier KPI right, or as accurate as possible, then all the downstream activities like production, sourcing, or any of those comes into play. To get the apex point right, there needs to be a constant information of changing ground realities from downstream activities. And the more touch points or nodes that you have on how do you make the sale to the customer, it kind of gets really complicated.
Got it. I also wanted to explore the connection between the team handling demand planning and the team responsible for sourcing. In production supply chains, we often see siloed systems where there's visibility within teams, but not necessarily across teams. So, what's the current situation like in service supply chains? Are there similar silos that add another layer of complexity when it comes to managing operations?
I mean, having intra-team visibilities or inter-team visibilities is, of course, it's on everyone's wish list. It's easier said than done. I'm just going to give you a scenario where suppose there's a central sourcing team and one of the supplier tells that, hey, there's an end of life happening, or there's a last run of the production for one of the critical components which they have. Suppose the purchasing team gets that intimation and they said like, hey, you have 30 days to place an order. The production team or this purchasing team needs to go ahead and check with the production team. Do you have any demand for this? Then you have to go with the service team. Hey, do you have any demand for this part? The service team, of course, as I told you how the supply chain network generally is designed, there are so many forward nodes that you have to kind of interact with that probably a dealer, a last mile customer itself, or depending on how many install bases you have and which industry you cater to, gathering all that information in real time and feeding it back to the purchasing team is rarely happening within 2 to 3 weeks, in my opinion, or from the experiences that I've seen in larger companies. Generally, the reaction time to any of these situations is anywhere between 45 to 60 days. Maybe there could be a lot of human dependent activities in this communication channel, that there is someone who is at a dealer who's probably on a summer vacation. So she or he doesn't give the forecast in right time. So the purchasing team who got an intimation of end of life won't be able to make the right quantities of orders. And what happens is the customer might end up losing valuable time and valuable money that could have been saved by placing the order in right time. So one is, and that for me is the real-time visibility, where you don't really have to kind of depend on so much communications and touch points just to gather real-time intelligence. And that fastens up decision making, and that fastens up time and money saved in the whole process. And right now, none of these tools really are supporting this. You have these supply chain collaboration tools. At the end of the day, it's a web version of a Microsoft Teams where you can chat and share files and all of those things, but it doesn't really capture any intelligence back to the systems. Or there could be an option where you have a supplier A versus supplier B. There is a lot of intelligence in terms of, hey, even if supplier B is sourcing or is offering a cheaper price, but in terms of the taxes, the complexities, or the customs might be a little more complex, which only someone at a logistics team might know, which the purchasing team might not know. And this all results in just poor decision making and revenue leakages. And finally, it culminates into either you're losing margins on your product or offering just poor service to the end customers. And in the end, it's not the people who are actually to be blamed in the system. It's the kind of tools they are equipped with. The intention of everyone is to do the best for the company and service the customers. But if you're given them with really wrong tools and wrong data, people will end up taking wrong decisions.
Makes sense. I like the example you brought up where it can take a company 45 to 60 days for data to be transferred from one part of the organization to another. I guess that even with processes in place, it's often hard for legacy systems that don't add much value beyond offering a platform for collaboration on a single interface. But when we look at the process itself, like you said, there are still gaps, right? Like someone gets sick, someone's on vacation, and suddenly things don't get pushed forward. Even with technology in daily operations, I believe these gaps remain. So I want to dive into process automation. Like, is there a way for companies to automate this entire process? Like, how can they ensure continuity even when exceptions occur, when the people responsible aren't there to monitor the process? Is there technology available that can bridge this gap and automate the process?
Well, yes, I would say there are technologies. It's just insanely expensive for a mid-sized company to actually acquire. If you can get all your suppliers, all the business partners, all the trading partners, all the internal colleagues on one single platform, it is possible. There are technologies or larger enterprise platforms available that help you achieve to this extent, but then that's a 5-year digital transformation strategy with millions of euros being spent. And I don't think that is a smart way of executing it. Now, the other alternative, which is slightly less expensive, are these RPA technologies, robotic process automation technologies out there. They've been in the market for a pretty long time, and they have found a fair use case in procure-to-pay transactions or some approval workflows and things like that. But it doesn't really fit the bill when it comes to supply chain. Because in supply chain, this is my opinion, that in supply chain decision-making, there is so much of knowledge, or tacit knowledge, as I call it, is required to make these intelligent decisions. And which, just an example, is like if I'm shipping something to Saudi Arabia, if it's more than the goods of value is more than 1,000 euros, I need a certificate of origin, or my taxes are a little bit more on it, my landed costs increase, etc., etc. So, and there are enough examples around the world. Or another example is if I get the packing list more than 2 decimals wrong versus the actual weight, there are certain customs in the world, especially in Latin America, that they stop the goods. Now, how do you get this knowledge on an automation system? You cannot. You might achieve a certain bit of automation, but at the end of the day, you will be struggling in terms of the uniqueness of the supply chain and the uniqueness of the decision-making process in supply chain. And larger the SKUs or the age of SKUs that you have, which is the service supply chain, this decision-making really just comes with experience. And that's where some of these old tools or legacy systems, like an ERP or a TMS systems, or the demand planning tools really fail to cater to this very specific challenges that are being thrown at. Now, there are, of course, new systems out there, which is a very emerging category, which very specifically designed keeping supply chain in mind, that is known as business orchestration and automation technology. That is something that is pretty unique in this space that solves constraints very specifically for supply chain. And as everyone knows, each supply chain is different because I spoke about, say, an example like forward stocking locations, dealers, install bases. Not all supply chains might have this network. There can be a different setup. And so the tools needs to be really adaptable. Maybe I'm not shipping to Saudi Arabia always. I'm just doing last mile deliveries. So that requires a different level of setup. And that is where it comes in, where you manage the regional requirements versus the central requirements. And if you start doing a global rollout of a TMS or one of these solutions, on the edge or data will always get missed. Or the usage would be so bad, people would get into the old ways of working, of spreadsheets and emails, because the tools are not adaptable to regional requirements. And these regional requirements also keep changing. And that's why this emerging technologies like business orchestration and automation tool plays a really important role in addressing this gap.
I'd like to dive deeper into the factors that impact service supply chains. On one side, we have internal factors like the lack of visibility and siloed approaches between teams. But there are also external factors, right? For example, let's take a recall, like when a company such as Toyota has had to recall hundreds of thousands of vehicles due to faults across its history. And these are completely unpredictable, right? How do companies handle these situations? In retail supply chains, we have peak season demands. Every year there's a spike, and while companies can't actually predict the exact numbers, they can still prepare by stocking up. But with these quote unquote black swan events, like a massive recall, there's no way to predict when they'll happen or how severe they would be. So what can companies do to manage these unexpected situations? Do they even have systems in place to tackle such unpredictable events when they arise?
Vishnu, I'm just going to giggle a bit because, it's again a wish list for everyone's. It's a dream come true for most people if people can predict black swan events and manage the correct product placing and inventories in the right places so that they achieve the right levels of service at the least level of costs. That's everyone's wish list and everyone's objective. Now, you give an example of product recalls, and of course, that's a nightmarish kind of a situation that you hopefully never face in your lifetime. Now, on a usual situation basis, service supply chain also brings in, again, one of the challenges is the people factor to it. There is also, because you need service technicians to kind of address the service demands. And that's a factor which you cannot account for if there is unrest, if there is a geopolitical situation, even if it's, say, a natural disaster. The service levels, of course, would go down and you will not be able to predict, or there are some strikes. Now, a lot of supply chain leaders have been kind of looking at, say, generative AI as probably a solution, but that's where I also fail to struggle, how generative AI is an answer to kind of some of these solutions, because you're not generating anything. The use cases are largely on customer support and services, which is like a chat bot kind of a per se. It doesn't really address the core problems or business values that a supply chain can deliver. And in my opinion, the answer to that is causal AI that understands really cause and effects between the various events that happen around the world. And that will derive a much more longer reaction time to it. Of course, I'm refraining from using the black swan events, but if there's a disruption that can happen based on certain events, and if you get an advance in about 3 to 6 months, completely unheard of in supply chain, you are well equipped. And I'm going to reemphasize the fact that the people who run supply chain are really smart people. Nothing beats their experience. It's just that they don't have the right tools, right visibility, and the right lag in time so that they can take better decisions. And this is where Holocene has a unique perspective, because we really think generative AI is super awesome. It's so super awesome for certain use cases. For us, it's always the causal AI that we are building into reading about 200 years of the history of mankind and understand what are the cause and effects. So a certain effect that happens again, we can predict what would be an outcome. For example, I'll say if there are weather patterns in sub-Saharan Africa, we can understand there will be a drought situation in Northern Africa, which is slightly under geopolitical tensions. And this can directly lead to a crisis in Red Sea, because any kind of uptick in, say an uptick in a drought situation directly results in an uptick in, say, piracy in the Red Sea, which impacts the freight costs, freight rates. And these are some of the predictions that a causal AI system can do months in advance. And you can prepare for the worst case scenario. Not everyone can predict the next COVID situation or when the next corona or, say, a product recall would happen, but you can predict months in advance when there's going to be a geopolitical situation or a change in the freight costs. And that's all experts in supply chain need, just enough time to react to things quickly. In the start of the call, which I said, it takes about 45 to 60 days of reactivity in terms of just on something like, an end of life, last production run by a supplier. It takes about 45 to 50 days to kind of even respond back to a supplier. You just need visibility on information that is coming in so that you can reduce the reactivity time. And that's what we are building on. We believe in standardizing all the unstructured information that we gather from outside world, be it transportation, be it lead times, be it unsaid rules about knowledge, which you cannot store it on an ERP or a TMS, and offer some kind of predictive analysis so that you can react to worst case situations better. And that's what Holocene is, bringing more stability and prosperity in supply chain.
That's really interesting. What you're describing sounds like a sophisticated predictive model, one that, goes beyond just analyzing existing patterns, but can also understand the underlying causes behind events to make more accurate predictions. So what do companies need to do to implement this kind of technology into their tech stack? I understand that companies are already using different kinds of demand planning tools, and their tech stacks are often kind of bloated with, different piecemeal and global solutions. And this kind of leads to issues in itself because of the lack of standardization, and the problem of siloed systems obviously are creating systems that are not interoperable. So in this context, where does the predictive analytics tool fit? Like, what is the process for a company to adopt such a solution?
So, Vishnu, I'm going to start going to repeat on that first point, which I said that demand plan is sits on the apex when it comes to managing or managing your service levels or cost and supply chain. And there are awesome tools. The tools themselves are not bad. It's just they're not fed with the right information, and most of the times they are blindsided with the external informations. Just a simple situation, right? if everyone knows about it, like we have a Red Sea crisis, the transportation time to, say, eastbound from Europe or, say, westbound from Asia to Europe, that got changed by about weeks. And that means your supply plan needs to kind of be tweaked. That means in case you're distributing, your demand production plan needs to be tweaked. The demand still remains the same. There's no change in order volumes, but there is a downward impact on the transportation time. How quickly can this information be standardized and sent back? Is the name of the game. I haven't seen a demand planning tool really kind of taking into account the changing transportation lead times and making sure that the production and the supply plans are changed. And that's the first step that one needs to kind of work on, is just making sure that all that external information is captured in a standardized way so it can be reused by systems, machines, tools, and at the end of the day, human beings like us to take decisions. And that's where the first step is just missing in it, that people just think either it is too complicated to kind of capture all the world information and standardize it and make it sure that it kind of feeds into the right tools. Because it's an IT problem. If I just look into this, if I just bifurcate, while the business need is a very supply chain problem. And these two worlds are a little complicated when they start interacting with each other. And it's best to kind of do the heavy lifting outside so that the decision making is still left internal. And that's what, in my opinion, companies should be focusing on. What are their strengths? Is making really good products, shipping them fast, or capturing demand, whatever their strengths are, work on it and find the right tools and technologies who can enable these rather than giving hope. Because the amount of knowledge and expertise outside is much more than inside the company.
I really like your point about how what seems like an IT issue is really a supply chain problem at its core. A lot of companies struggle with this. They're fundamentally supply chain companies, but they keep adding more technology, thinking it would boost efficiency. But in the end, they often see themselves spending a lot of money without getting, the expected results. It's been a great, insightful, and interesting conversation, Navneet. We covered a lot of ground on service supply chains, and I truly appreciate your thoughts. Thank you so much for being on the show, and I hope to see you again soon.
Thanks a lot, Vishnu. I enjoyed the conversation too.
This wraps up another episode of the In Transit podcast. To learn more or to hear previous episodes, check out our website at scmr.com/podcast/all or check the podcast segment on thelogisticsreport.com. Thank you for listening and have a wonderful day.